Excellent.
Hey guys, hope you're all doing well. So, recently there was a debate between Dave Smith and Douglas Murray. It wasn't a formal debate with like a pre-selected topic. It was just sort of an informal discussion debate on the Joe Rogan Experience. And it was an absolutely brilliant debate with Joe acting sort of as a moderator. But yeah, it was just fantastic. So, like, first of all, I dig both of the guys, like, for different reasons. Like, Dave is anti-Israel, seemingly slightly pro-Hamas, even though he will say he is not pro-Hamas. He still basically obfuscates for them. And Douglas Murray is obviously pro-Israel. Dave is, like, I share a lot of Dave's opinions and values. He's like an anti-vaxxer, pro-individual rights libertarian. So I just share like most of his opinions there. Douglas is also pretty pro-freedom and human rights with the jab, and obviously I support his anti-Palestine, pro-Israel view. I'm probably, just full disclosure, I'm way more anti-Islamic than either of them, especially Douglas. Douglas holds the opinion that it's not all Muslims. I will hold the opinion that it is majority of Muslims. Just by simple fact of obfuscation and that sort of deal. Similar to the opinion held by Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. People claimed it wasn't Lenin, it was only Stalin that caused, communism and all that sort of shit. Solzhenitsyn, claimed it was Lenin as well. So, yeah. Basically similar to, like, that sort of thing. I don't hold that against Douglas. Obviously, Douglas is a public figure that can be easily smeared as an Islamophobe and is in, particular trouble in the UK. He can, like, literally be thrown into prison by Starmer, for, anti-Islamic, anti-mass immigration views. So, like, I don't hold it against him. That being said, I think Dave was out of his depth and nervous from the start in the debate. To be fair, Douglas Murray is very daunting to argue against. Like, even when Douglas Murray, like, stopped interrupting Dave after, Joe told him not to, and Dave kept interrupting, Douglas Murray still calmly took him apart. And that's, like, in the face of some absolutely brutal child-killing appeals to emotions from Dave Smith, talking about, children dying in rubble and suffocating and all that sort of thing. This whole debate was like a strategic war. It's one of the more impressive debates I've seen, actually. And obviously Douglas eventually won. He just outmaneuvered Dave and eventually maneuvered Dave into a position where Dave was arguing for appeals to authority, which, like, goes against pretty much every one of his values. And then once Dave was arguing for, the appeals to authority of his sources, Douglas just essentially dismissed him. And, like, that pretty badly upset Dave as well. And, like, Dave was already nervous by that point. Just took him apart. Like, I would hate to argue anything. Like, it's a good thing I agree with most of Douglas Murray's points. I would hate to fucking argue anything against him. He's a fucking genius. Like, so the whole thing was just a battle. It just opened up with Douglas essentially dismissing Dave and others as not experts and pointing out that the limited framing and incomplete or incorrect narratives of popular influencers can lead to people supporting Nazism, condemning Churchill, condemning Ukraine, basically infiltrating right and centrist right political positions with views like that, despite, Hitler and Putin both being, as corrupt or more corrupt, and both being aggressors, and invading first, and just the whole thing. It acts as just sort of an incorrect sort of moral relativistic position, sort of. Basically, he was also drawing attention to people who say Ukraine is corrupt, and say because Ukraine was corrupt, and there was a lot of weird corrupt separatist activity on the eastern border with Russia at the time of the invasion, that Putin was sort of justified and that sort of deal. Douglas just pointed out sort of that, Putin's obviously more corrupt than anything in the Ukraine, even though the Ukraine is, just horribly fucking corrupt. And, that's not to say Ukraine's not corrupt, just pointing out, the kind of fucking shit that happens in Ukraine. At one point, they were caught selling US-supplied arms to both Islamists and drug cartels for cash. So that's obviously not good. That's arming two absolutely fucking awful groups with, overwhelming force. To this, Dave responded with something I absolutely agree with. He said, "You shouldn't be censored because you're not an expert. You shouldn't rely purely on credentials and authority in an argument without addressing the point. Nor do you get to force the framing on a conversation by forcefully injecting experts into the conversation to debunk people against the consent of, both of the parties of the conversation." I just totally agree with that point, especially with him talking about the Jabberoonie. It's just a good point. What, you're going to allow the government and government-appointed experts to control, fact-check narratives? The government's the fucking worst party of anything here. The government's like an institution run by, narcissists and sociopaths and weird cunts that want power. It's a fucking terrible idea to grant them excessive influence over speech. Douglas isn't saying he is for censorship here. He's saying you still get to say your opinion, but you should also be forced to have an expert there to debunk your opinion. That's just granting government excessive control over narrative and framing that it doesn't really deserve. Because, even if it can't directly censor your points of view, it can effectively silence them with the framing of arguments. And it's just still this government attempt to control speech, which I don't agree with. To this, Douglas pointed out that influencers sometimes make basic mistakes that are factually incorrect, and that would have them, if they were known, just dismissed out of hand for their lack of knowledge, but tend to fly by on just charisma on their audience, not caring, and especially if they don't debate anyone, they never get challenged on them. And because of this, the right is getting infiltrated with Islamic Jew haters and pro-Russians that are downplaying Putin's invasion, downplaying things like the Holocaust, and obviously downplaying Hamas. Hamas is also not a great point. Hamas, Dave downplays Hamas, taking away, the agency of all the Palestinians that elected Hamas. But, whatever. At this point, both Dave and Joe sort of tag team Douglas for this point. And look, fair enough, it is an appeal to authority, and it is directly impacting free speech. Eventually the whole discussion devolves into Gaza, with Douglas essentially just dismissing outright Dave's claims, because Dave has never been there, he's not an authority on it, that sort of deal. Dave responds with, "That's an appeal to authority," which starts off the whole thing. Dave then claims it's a concentration camp because Israel controls its borders. Douglas points out that they're controlling the borders to prevent them smuggling in weapons and rockets, which Hamas then uses on civilians. Dave gets a little bit flustered, claims it's a camp again. Douglas points out that the population grew and that they aren't starving, so it's not a death camp. He also points out that the funding in the bunkers, it's from the taxpayer and the UN, all the corruption there. Dave claims that they are targeting women and children and civilians and housing. Now that Gaza is rubble, I fucking really hate that point. Like, it just completely ignores Islamists throughout the entire history of Islamism, especially like Hamas and Hezbollah directly targeting, in this instance, civilians, Jewish civilians, randomly with rockets. But like Islamists have done this throughout their entire history. Soft ethnic cleansings, extrajudicial killings of blasphemers and apostates in the countries that they colonially take control of. Fucked. I hate this point. That's the stupidest, most fucking hypocritical point. It would be like accusing Jewish people of being Nazis. It's absolutely fucking disgusting. And it also like ignores Hamas's tactics and battle doctrine. Like they literally directly firing from civilian areas like hospitals, mosques, and that sort of thing. But like they're 100% responsible for turning those areas into war zones. But like Dave just breezes past that point, just holds Israel directly responsible for any sort of bombing that happens in these areas. Like it's like a direct appeal to emotion after that, because he just pushes forward with this scene, this appeal to emotion of like a kid dying underneath rubble in a collapsed building. Like with the framing is just completely unacceptable. It's just completely absolving Hamas of putting themselves in that building, fighting from that building, deliberately knowing that there were kids in that building, and legally making it a military target at the same time. Like it's just completely unacceptable framing, and it just completely absolves Hamas and Palestinians of agency. I fucking hate that point. And like at that point, Douglas talks about October 7th and how Hamas doesn't follow the rules of war, uses the rules of war against the Israelis. Like, it's a fair point. Why should only the Israelis be forced by the UN to fight using the rules of war? Like, the UN as a whole is just fucked. It's completely ignored Islamists in Africa, in Syria, killing Christians and Alawites. Like, the UN can just shut the fuck up. It, like, hasn't done its job at all. It's clearly got this like massive Islamic bloc in it, voting pro-Islam bias, and just like obfuscating for and ignoring all the Islamic forces in conflicts globally that are breaking the rules of war. Like Islamic forces in like Africa and everywhere else, they do horrible shit all the time, like taking hostages, torturing civilians, torturing prisoners of war, raping civilians, raping prisoners of war, murdering civilians, targeting the Christians and Alawite minorities in Islamic countries. Even things like Hamas not like wearing uniforms during their attack on Israel to blend the lines between civilians and combatants, like forcing Israelis into like this fucked impossible game of like unfair no backsies tag. Like it wasn't in this debate, but like Douglas also pointed out that Hamas had previously used like the captured uniforms of dead Israelis to attack directly Israeli civilians in like a Alpha Legion propaganda false flag. Like, and like the media, everything around this, like the Palestinian journalists, like Taqiyya is the thing. Like, you really can't trust Muslims. They lie as a matter of doctrine. Like, you should not trust them as far as you can throw them. To this, Dave just completely skirts around the point. Douglas makes another point about authoritarian nations not facing backlash from their people. like authoritarian and totalitarian nations not facing backlash from their people just because they're authoritarian and totalitarian, and tend to like kill and torture people to silence them and that sort of thing, and how that just like builds this obvious bias and one-sided media view of Israel Palestine, and like other issues as well. Like this can be applied to communism as well. Communism lasted longer and was probably worse than the Nazis, but because they didn't have any sort of free speech in Commuland, it gets completely overlooked. Like, it wasn't until like the Gulag Archipelago and shit like that came out that people started turning against communism. And like intellectuals, they seem to have this unspoken love of like communist authoritarianism and control of peasants, because they always seem to defend socialist views like this, where experts get put into charge, and fundamental human rights like free speech, right to consent to medical procedures, that sort of thing, they get thrown onto the back burner and just kind of dissolved. Like being censored on Facebook because of your opinions about COVID or the lockdowns, like that's direct trampling on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of movement. The left just kind of wholesale embraced that sort of shit, and it's just like an example of this leftist love of totalitarianism, and how when you control speech, you control critics, and silence them. And if there's no critics criticizing your position, it gets viewed as popular, especially when you're looking at it back through the lens of history. If you've burnt all the records criticizing you, then, you know, your view seems to have been popular. There seems to be more justified, let's say. Dave sort of dismisses all this by saying Hamas is a gang of guerrilla fighters, they're not that in control, completely just eliminating the agency of both Palestinians who elected Hamas, or the idea that Hamas is a government and controls media in the Gaza and kills and tortures critics and all that sort of thing. Douglas points out that they were given a state and elected Hamas with a majority of the vote. Dave claims that the majority of the Palestinians don't support Hamas. I don't see how he can claim this. Like, Hamas won the majority of the vote in the election. It seems to me to be just trying to remove the agency from just Islamist Palestinians in general, and Hamas in general, framing them as like some sort of victim rather than a terrorist supporting population with a terrorist government, which is what they are, if we're being honest. At some point here, Dave makes the mention of how Gaza is bombed, and Murray counters with it's because Hamas have booby-trapped every second or third house, and every second or third house has entrances to the underground tunnels. Obviously, if Hamas has set up a series of mines on top of each other, especially like how the Russians used to do in World War II, they would set one mine, and then with a pressure plate or whatever, then set another mine on top of it. So it's basically impossible to disarm, so you had to blow it up. I'm assuming Hamas have done similar here. Yeah, so if they've just set like a series of mines on top of each other, the chances of defusing one without setting off the other is just close to zero. The safest thing to do is obviously just to blow them up, rather than, you know, risk your life defusing them. This comes at the cost of civilian housing, which Hamas have put all the mines in. Obviously, and because, you know, Dave has removed all agency from Palestinians, though he holds the Israelis 100% responsible for this, like destroying all the houses and everything. Yeah, it's just crazy. That point of view is just insane. Especially, like, had the Israelis left all the booby-trapped houses and everything there, there's a really good chance that Palestinian civilians returning to those houses would have triggered the traps, due to, let's say, like the high turnover of Hamas terrorists, the loss of records, like if they're even recording where all the mines are, which fucking there's a good chance they're not. There was a book I read called like Malice Aforethought. It's just about the history of using traps and mines in warfare, and it just has this horrible line in it. Wherever mines are excessively used, civilians usually trigger them, because usually, especially in urban war zones, there's civilians fucking everywhere. If you're setting mines and mining houses and mining streets and everything, and civilians are just trying to get from one place to the other, usually trying to flee the area, there's a good chance that the civilians are just gonna, trigger it. And it just had this horrible line. I think it was about Myanmar, or it might have been Vietnam. The operation to clear the mines is still continuing to this day. They are still being disarmed to this day, one leg at a time and one arm at a time. Like, that just means, like, after the war, the mines, especially if they're set in, like, let's say, like a Soviet manner, where they're placed on top of each other, they're basically impossible to disarm without triggering them, which is the case. They usually just get left there, and civilians usually find them and just, blow themselves up with them. And, like, none of this is going to get talked about, because, like, Hamas is running Gaza like a fucking totalitarian state. The critics of Hamas get tortured, like the guy that Douglas mentions, who had, like, bruises from rods all over his back. He got, like, tortured to death and then dumped on his family doorstep. Like, no one talks about like that. Like, how many times has, like, a Palestinian or a Palestinian family returned to a house that's booby-trapped, triggered the booby traps, absolutely blown themselves up and blown the house up, and then Israel's just got blamed for it? Like, that probably happens all the time. Just like the rockets that fall short, that are, like, aimed at Jewish civilians in Israel from Gaza, that fall short, land in Gaza, and just wipe out, like, Palestinians in Gaza. Like, how many times has Israel been blamed for that as well? Like, there's no independent journalism there. They're all fucking pro Palestine there. Yeah. And, like, when the rockets fall short, they fall short for whatever reason. Islamic inbreeding, incompetent, knowledge of rocketry, sabotage within the Islamic ranks. Who knows? They can fall short for a number of reasons. Yeah. But, like, at this point, Dave claims that Israel is making more terrorists. The point is stupid. The logical conclusion of that point is to surrender to the ideology, which breaks the rules of war. It's absolutely unacceptable. Douglas counters that they have agency and they only respond to force because of their ideology, which is a true point. He also points out that Palestinians are anti-Hamas activists that have been tortured and killed and dumped on their family's doorstep, like that one dude that I mentioned earlier. Dave says America is responsible for most global conflict. Douglas says they aren't. History isn't simple because of the fog of war. At that point, Dave quotes some cabinet guy, Dick Wolfstein or whatever. I wasn't paying attention. Douglas has a banger of a joke about the first part of his name being a scary animal and the last part being Jewish, and Joe laughs his ass off at it. That kind of flusters Dave, who now, starts sort of hypocritically asserting the authority of his figure and his source in an appeal to authority. And then, ergo, Douglas, in a complete genius moment, has managed to destroy Dave Smith by walking him into the exact fallacy that Dave accused Douglas of at the start of the conversation. Douglas is an intellectual powerhouse. He really is. Like, Dave isn't a pushover. He's got a strong analytical mind, and he used strong appeals to emotion in the argument. But, Douglas just outmaneuvered him and then dismissed him. Just complete genius. Fucking extremely well done.